Okay, we will now move on to the last part covering the Sacrament of Reconciliation, Canon 959 to 997, and the second part will be the sacrament, will be the sanctions or penalties. Okay, let us take a look at the Sacrament of Reconciliation first. First, regarding the celebration of the sacrament, according to the rite of celebration issued by the congregation for the sacraments. There are three rites. There are three possible rites. One, individual confession. A person goes to the penitent goes to the confessor, confesses the sins. The confessor advises, the confessor imposes the penance, and the confessor absolves. A second way is where there is a penitential service for the community. Sometimes this is done in religious communities, in seminaries, where they have readings. There is a little homily on sin or repentance or conversion, and then they go to confession, individual confession, and then the absolution is given in the confession, and also the penance, but sometimes the penance may be said together. The third is the so-called general absolution, when there is no individual confession by number and species. By number and species, you mean I by species I did not go to mass. How many times? 5 times. I said bad words, species. How many times? Etc. However, the code refers only to two general types. Canon 980 talks about the individual and integral confession, and according to the canon, it is the it is the ordinary way by which the faithful are reconciled with God. Canon 961 to Canon 963 talks about the absolution is imparted in a general manner without the previous individual confession of sin by number and species. We will get to that in a individual and integral confession according to number and species constitute the only ordinary way by which a person is reconciled with God and the church. What may be considered as the extraordinary way of obtaining forgiveness for one's sins are either the general absolution or the perfect contrition. These are the circumstances which would mitigate the obligation to be reconciled with God in the ordinary way, individual and integral confession, and thus following either the general absolution or communion that should be preceded by perfect contrition. Sometimes it might be physically impossible. Imagine there is imminent danger of death and there is no time to confess. The ship is sinking, or there is an NPA attack. There is when the church was attacked in some place in Mindanao, the Ampatuan massacre, or when there's a flood or landslide, or when there is no praise available. What are these cases? It is physically impossible for penitents to be able to go to confession. In which case, a person can take resort to the perfect contrition. Moral impossibility. When there is a possibility, moral impossibility means there may be a priest. So it is not as though it's physically impossible. But morally impossible because there is a possibility that the seal might be broken. The confessor suspects you of dating his niece, for example. Grave scandal or loss of reputation. A man is generally held to be a righteous man, but he has committed adultery, and the wife suspects. If he goes to confession, the wife will suspect, and if he does not receive communion, the wife will also suspect. Or you have a serious reason not to trust the confessor, or you are you uh, but the confessor is somebody with whom you have sinned against the sixth commandment. There is a priest, but it is not morally possible. Now, in which case, uh, you can make the act of perfect contrition. Oh my God, I'm heartily sorry for having offended thee, and I detest all my sins because I dread the loss of heaven and the pains of hell, but most of all because I have offended you, my God, who are so good and deserving of all my love. I firmly resolve, with the help of your grace, to confess my sins when I get the chance, to amend my life a so-called perfect contrition. Now, let us say something about this general absolution. What should be said about this general absolution? One, it is not the it is not a an easier alternative for those who would rather not go to the individual and integral confession. What is it then? Canon 961 says the general absolution is allowed when there is physical or moral impossibility for an individual to make his confession in the ordinary way, as envisioned by Canon 960. And the sacramental absolution may be imparted in a general way without the required individual confession of sin according to number and species. We're talking now about the general absolution. What are the general conditions? Well, there is an imminent danger of death and there's no time to make a confession. Uh, for example, you were a passenger, you were a priest and you were a passenger in the Titanic, and the Titanic was sinking. And you can gather the Catholics, and there is an imminent danger of death and no time to make a confession, so you can give them the general absolution. There is a serious necessity. What does serious necessity here mean? Well, you are saying in the light of the number of penitents, there are not enough confessors. There are not enough confessors to hear the individual confession within an appropriate amount of time. You can not make the penitents wait for 3 weeks while they await to come to confession. And if they are unable to make their confession now, they will be deprived of the sacramental grace and Holy Communion for a long period of time. And it is not because they were not in church, it's simply that there is no, there are not enough confessors. Now, it is important to take a look at the second paragraph of Canon 961. Paragraph. It is for the diocesan bishop to determine whether the conditions required by the first paragraph of Canon 961 are present. This would seem to mean that the bishop lays down the concrete conditions beforehand in the form of pastoral guidelines applicable in his diocese that will guide the individual pastors to determine whether the requisite conditions are indeed present. Now, in the Philippines, the CBCP, not individual bishop, but the CBCP as defined by virtue of Canon 961 paragraph 2, the concrete cases in which gravis necessitas, the grave necessity, may exist. For example, what would be the elements of a grave necessity in the Philippines? The CBCPs enumerate some of the conditions. One, if the place is a place rarely visited by the priest, only a few times a year, and therefore access to the sacraments would be severely limited. This is probably not true in Metro Manila, but there are places, mission territories. When I was a parish priest in Pitay in Zamboanga del Sur, there were 3 or 4 barrio chapels that I and the other priests could visit only once, twice a year during their fiesta. And when I go there, uh, the catechists teach them new songs. They prepare the children for baptism and for first communion, etc., etc., etc. That would be an occasion for, and if you cannot hear their confession, then that would be a good time to do the general absolution. If there is an occasion that fosters deep religious fervor, Easter Triduum, popular mission preaching, retreats for large number of people, local religious fiestas. You can imagine the fiesta of the Santo Niño in Cebu and in other places, the fiesta of the Black Nazarene in Quiapo and in many other places. Many people would like to approach the sacrament, and there are not enough confessors. Now, what would be required on the part of the penitents? First, the proper disposition, as in any confession. What is the proper disposition? Sorrow and contrition for sin, and the promise to avoid sins altogether again in the future. There must also be a serious intention to make the integral confession by number and species, the serious sins which at the present time cannot be so confessed. That is to say, you are if there is a if there are serious sins that are now absolved via the general absolution, the penitent must also, part of the requisite condition would be the intention to be able to confess these sins and perhaps to be advised about them when they have the chance to do so. When should they do that? Canon 963 says they should try to go to the integral confession by number and species before availing of another general absolution. And Canon 989, the obligation to approach the sacrament at least once a year. And I don't know if you memorize it, but we used to memorize the precepts of the church in grade school. When should we go to confession and receive communion at least once a year during Easter time? Regarding the third condition, someone may ask, why the need to confess again the sins already absolved in the general absolution? Somebody might say, why? It was not forgiven, it was not absolved before, or it was absolved only conditionally? My answer to that is no, it was not absolved only conditionally. It was forgiven, it was absolved in an absolute way. The requirement of uh, Canon 962 paragraph 1 is only a disciplinary norm to encourage people to approach the normal penitential sacrament, to be able to be counseled and encouraged by the confessor. I think there is also a psychological point to going to confession. Not only because uh, you will be advised or counseled by the confessor. Why not? Well, because the main purpose of the sacrament of reconciliation is not to be counseled. It is not a counseling session. It is to be absolved and forgiven. But I think there is also a psychological point. It makes a difference to be able to hear, to be able to be told, yes, your sins are forgiven. Yes, I absolve you from all your sins. It is good to hear that. There is something liberating about hearing that from the confessor. It is almost like a catharsis to hear from the priest that yes, you are forgiven. So it is. I think there is a point to the condition of approaching the sacrament, the ordinary sacrament of penance, even after having been absolved in a general way. Before we go to the minister of the sacrament, this is a question that has arisen during this pandemic. People who want to go to confession. Can I make my confession online? Can I make my confession over the phone? Can I make my confession on Zoom? My general answer to those questions is no, not through the phone, not through email, not through Zoom. Why not? Because of the risk, because of the danger of breaking the confessional secret. In other words, it's entirely possible to be for the secrecy of the confession to be breached. So, what is the solution then? Well, my solution, my pastoral approach has been to say, okay, I will, you can call me, do not mention the names, sorry, do not mention the sins, and I will absolve you over the phone. I will absolve you over Zoom, but no sin must be mentioned. This is to preserve the sanctity and the integrity of the confession. Now, regarding the minister of the sacraments, Canon 965 to Canon 986, namely you when you are ordained, and you when you get your faculties to hear confession. The fundamental norm, Canon 965, only an ordained priest is the minister of the sacrament. Perhaps in addition, relative to this, there was a question before whether kaabags, parish chapel leaders in Mindanao whether they can anoint the sick, whether they can celebrate the sacrament of the sick. And the answer from the doctrine of the faith was that no, they cannot, non-priests cannot, because the sacrament of the sick involves and includes the sacrament of reconciliation, and only an ordained priest is the minister, can be the minister of the sacrament. In addition to the power of orders received in ordination, the minister must further have the faculty to exercise the power of orders, the so-called power of jurisdiction. Another way of putting it is that the priest must be allowed by the superior of the penitent, usually the bishop, to absolve his subject. The power of jurisdiction is granted by in either of the three ways. The power of orders is, of course, conferred in the sacrament of ordination to the presbytery. But the power of jurisdiction is granted via three ways. First, by virtue of the law itself, Canon 967, paragraph 1. Who are the priests who have the power to hear, who have the power to exercise the power to absolve by virtue of the law itself? The Pope and the Cardinals have the power of jurisdiction anywhere in the world. Regarding the power of the Pope and the Cardinals, no ordinary can limit this power. In the case of cardinals, they may be deprived of this power if a cardinal is under censure. What is a censure? We will say something about that under penalties. Bishops also enjoy this jurisdiction all over the world, and should an ordinary limit this by withdrawing the jurisdiction, the withdrawal is effective only in the jurisdiction of that ordinary, and this withdrawal in any case only affects the legitimity, not the validity of the absolution. For example, Bishop Jesse Mercado is the Bishop of Parañaque. By virtue of Canon 967, paragraph 1, he has the power to absolve by virtue of the law itself. And he can exercise the same power anywhere in the world. Now, supposing, I don't know why, but supposing he and Bishop Pabilio are in disagree over a certain question, and Bishop Pabilio withdraws this jurisdiction. He forbids Bishop Mercado from hearing confessions. The withdrawal is effective only in the jurisdiction of that ordinary, Bishop Pabilio. And this withdrawal, so Bishop Mercado cannot, will have no jurisdiction in Manila. Can he hear confession in Cubao? Yes. Can he hear confession in Bulacan? Yes. Can he hear confession in Batangas? Yes. But in any case, what happens if he hears confession in Manila anyway? This withdrawal only affects the legitimity, not the validity of the absolution. A second way is by virtue of the office. Certain offices in the church bring with them the faculty to hear confessions and to absolve sins. What are these offices? The local ordinary, Canon 134, paragraph 2. The Canon Penitentiary, Canon 509. In the Philippines, we do not have canon penitentiaries. Parish priests, pastors, and those who take their place, Canon 519 and 540. Rectors of seminaries, Canon 262. Chaplains of hospitals, chaplains of schools, military chaplains, Canon 564, Canon 566. Superiors of clerical institutes, the rector of the seminaryo ng Don Bosco, he would have the power to hear confessions by virtue of his office. In other words, when somebody becomes a local ordinary, when somebody becomes pastor, he does not have to go to the bishop, as it were, to say, Father, Your Excellency, can I have the can I have the jurisdiction to hear confession? Can I have the faculty to hear confession? The mere fact that you are a pastor, you already have, by that very fact, by virtue of your office, the power, the jurisdiction to exercise the power of office. So, the first way to get it is by virtue of the law itself. Second way to get it is by virtue of office. And the third way of getting it is by virtue of concession, by concession of competent ecclesiastical. Who is the competent authority? In general, this means the authority allows a confessor to hear the confession of his subject. So, who is the competent authority? Who can give the jurisdiction? Who can give the delegation to hear confession? Canon 969, paragraph 1, the local ordinary for his subjects. Canon 969, paragraph 2, the superiors of a religious institute, clerical and of pontifical right, also for his subjects. The mechanics of delegation. How do you get if you are asking for, or how do you give if you are the authority competent to grant? Canon 967, paragraph 2, the grant of the ordinary of the place of incardination. So, if you are incardinated in Manila, the local ordinary of Manila can give you the faculty to hear confessions. The Yesuan priest with faculties from the ordinary of incardination can exercise this faculty everywhere in the world. Second, Canon 967, paragraph 2, the grant of the ordinary of the domicile. This would have particular application for religious, since religious do not have a local ordinary. They have a personal ordinary. The grant of the ordinary of the domicile, this can also be exercised everywhere. So, I have the faculty to hear confessions from the ordinary of my domicile, Bishop Ong Tioco, Bishop of Cubao. I have my domicile in Cubao. And because I have this faculty from the ordinary of my domicile, I can exercise the same faculty everywhere. So for the diocesan priests, you can get your jurisdiction from the ordinary of incardination. And you can use this faculty everywhere. I would imagine that military chaplains would get their uh, jurisdiction from their from the military ordinary. The grant of the ordinary of the domicile and my faculty to hear confessions can also be exercised everywhere. The limits to these faculties. Those who have the faculties ipso iure, the cardinal, the pope, have no limitations. That of a bishop may be denied in a particular case by a local ordinary. If so denied, the denial affects the faculty only in that denying ordinary's jurisdiction. Such a denial, as we said in my example of Bishop Mercado and Bishop Pabilio, the denial affects only the legitimity, not the validity of the absolution. Those who have the faculty in virtue of their office or by concession of a competent authority, they are the parish priest, you get it by virtue of your office. I, by virtue of my delegation from the ordinary of my uh, domicile, we can exercise the same faculty everywhere unless denied in a particular case. The denial of this faculty affects the denying authority's jurisdiction only. Such a denial affects the validity of the absolution. Such a denial affects the validity of the absolution. If you have it by virtue of office or by virtue of concession of a competent ecclesiastical authority. Cessation of the faculty. One way for the faculty to cease is by revocation. When the faculty to hear confession is revoked by the ordinary who granted it, either ordinary of incardination or domicile, the confessor loses that faculty everywhere. If revoked by any other ordinary, he loses it only in the territory of that revoking ordinary. Canon 975, the faculty to hear confession can also be lost by A, the loss of office, the loss of domicile, or excardination. When you, the loss of office, by that you mean when you are removed as pastor, for example. But if you are transferred from one parish to another, you don't really lose your office. You lose one, but you also gain another. So you don't really lose the faculty to hear confession. The loss of office means if you are removed as pastor, for example, and you are not given a new parish, then you lose the faculty to hear confession. If you are removed as rector of the seminary and you are not yet given a new office, then you lose the faculty to hear confession. For religious, the loss of domicile means also the loss of your faculty. So, if I were to be transferred from Cubao, from Loyola Heights, where I have my domicile now, and I am transferred to Xavier School in Manila, I lose my domicile in Cubao. Now I moved to the Archdiocese of Manila. I will have, by the time I get to Manila, to Xavier School in Green Hill, then I would have lost my faculty to hear confession. Then I will have to apply for a new faculty from Manila. When you are excardinated, presumably, if you're excardinated and incardinated in a new place, I don't know if you remember our no, I had no comment there, but in your section on pastors, priests, the mechanism of excardination and incardination happens simultaneously. You cannot be excardinated without being incardinated. So, uh, you don't really, if you're excardinated from one and incardinated in the other, you don't really lose your faculty to hear confession. If you are dismissed from the clerical state, then you are excardinated, you lose your office, and therefore you lose your faculty. From these comments, it would be the consequence of this then would be that uh, if you are a diocesan priest and you have gotten the faculty to hear confessions from your ordinary of incardination, you can exercise that faculty everywhere in the world. And in the ordinary course of events, you don't lose it unless it is revoked, of course. But in the normal course of events, you can exercise that everywhere. Even if you move domicile, yes, even if you move domicile, because your faculty to hear confession, if you are a diocesan priest, is not by virtue of your domicile, it's not from your ordinary of domicile, it is from your ordinary of incardination. So if you are now a assistant parish priest in Manila, and then you go to Rome to study, you lose your domicile. Do you lose your faculty to hear confession? No, because your faculty to hear confession is not from your domicile; it is uh, from your proper ordinary. Although what they do in Rome when you get there is that you get a little uh, card from the Vicariato di Roma where you are given faculties. Anyway, just to make sure, ad cautelam as they say. Particular norms. Canon 976. Any priest, even if even though he lacks the faculty to hear confession, validly and licitly absolves penitents who are in danger of death from any censures and sins, even if an approved priest is present. Any priest, excommunicated priest, any priest, lay size priest, any priest, a suspended priest, any priest, any priest, even if he lacks the faculty to hear confession, again, validly and licitly absolve penitents who are in danger of death from censures and sins. What is the why the censure? Because some censures forbid the reception of the sacrament. Interdict, excommunication, forbid the reception of the sacrament. That is why when somebody comes to you in confession and says, do not apply the exceptions, the rules now, comes to you and says, I have committed an abortion, or I have maliciously denounced a priest for solicitation, then he is under censure and you cannot absolve him. Why not? Because the censure of excommunication forbids the reception of the sacrament. But if he is in danger of death, you can absolve the penitents, you can remit the penalty, and absolve the sins, even if an approved priest is present. A second particular norm, Canon 977. An absolution of a partner in a sin against the sixth commandment of to be of the Decalogue is invalid except in danger of death. Comments about this. First, this is to be understood. Okay, first of all, the comment the sin against the sixth commandment. What is the sin against the sixth commandment? Sin against chastity. If you committed a sin against chastity with this person, either a male or a female, he is your accomplice in a sin against the sixth commandment, and you cannot absolve him validly except absolve him or her validly except in danger of death. Now, this is to be understood as a withdrawal of the faculty to absolve with respect to certain individual. In other words, your faculty to absolve is not withdrawn from you so that now you cannot absolve anyone. It is withdrawn with respect to certain individual. The person you do not have the faculty to absolve, the person with whom you committed a sin against the sixth commandment. A second comment. Outside the danger of death, the absolution is not only invalid, but the confessor also commits a grave crime with the penalty of excommunication, latae sententiae, reserved to the Holy See, Canon 1378. So when you absolve your accomplice in a sin against the sixth commandment, your absolution is not only invalid, but you commit a crime. What is the crime? Of absolving your accomplice against the sixth commandment. And the penalty of excommunication can only be lifted by the Holy See. It cannot be lifted by the bishop, it can only be lifted by the Holy See. Okay, let me say some comments regarding the accomplice. First, your accomplice in a sin against the sixth commandment The matter must be grave. In other words, holding her hand would not be grave, but groping her breast would be grave. Putting your hand on his shoulders would not be grave, but opening his zipper would be grave. In other words, when you sin with somebody, it must be grave. When did you commit the sin against the sixth commandment with this person? And the opinion of most moralists and canon lawyers is it does not matter. It could have been yesterday. It could have been done before ordination. It could have been done when you were 17. If he is your accomplice, then he is your accomplice. The matter of Canon 977 is accomplice. So, if the confessor was drugged or drunk, then maybe there was no freedom, or at least the freedom was mitigated, and it will be questionable whether 977 will apply. But if it is the partner who was drugged or drunk, opinion is divided, but I think the responsibility of the confessor is even aggravated rather than mitigated. Some questions about this sin, accomplice in a sin against the sixth commandment. Is the prohibition perpetual or only such until such sin has been absolved by another confessor? Regatilio and Capello think the prohibition ceases when the accomplice has been absolved by another confessor. And I agree with Regatilio and Capello. Capello is always a safe author to follow. Does the lack of faculty in regard only to the sin, or is it in regard to the sinner? It is not clear, but my opinion is that it applies to the sinner. That is to say, you cannot absolve the sinner. If he confesses to you, and you can say, okay, I can absolve sins 1, 2, 3. I cannot absolve 4, but I can absolve 5, 6, and 7. No. The prohibition of the canon is you cannot absolve. It is with respect to the sinner, not only with respect to the sin. A third particular norm: the confessor as a minister of the church. That should be Canon 978, not 9978. The confessor is not acting in his private personal capacity when he hears confession. He is both a judge and a healer, a minister both of divine justice and divine mercy. So you cannot, what is it? You cannot inject your personal opinion or your judgments in here. You have to go, you cannot, for example, you cannot say, I don't know why the church makes such a big thing out of it. In my private opinion, I don't think this is a grave sin, and so don't bother. That is not in your place. You are a minister of the church. On the other hand, you cannot be more strict than the church. You cannot say, that is such a grave sin, in my opinion. Of course, the Pope says we should be merciful, but I don't think that applies here. I think, etc. Remember that you are a minister of the church. You are acting in the name of the church. You are acting in the name of Christ, the head of the church. The fourth particular point regarding penances. The penance must be appropriate to the sin, first. It must be appropriate to the condition of the penitent. Second, the penance must be clear. Third, and the penance should not be revelatory of the sin context. Let me say a couple of things about those. The penance must be appropriate to the sin. If the person is a policeman or a judge and he confesses that he gave a warrant of arrest to a person that was only red tag, but there was no concrete evidence, and the person was eventually killed, and he comes to you, and the judge comes to you and confesses this, and they say, okay, say one Our Father, one Hail Mary, one Glory to the Father. It is not appropriate. The penance must be appropriate to the sin. On the other hand, if the person has committed, if a teenager, 14, 15-year-old boy confesses that he has visited a porn site and he has masturbated, and you say, go to the church in Quiapo and work and walk on your knees from the gate all the way up to the altar and back. It must be appropriate to the sin. Second, it must be appropriate to the condition of the penitent. By the condition of the penitent, I think it means, is the penitent remorseful? Sometimes this is where you ask questions to determine whether the penitent is remorseful. If the even if the sin is even if the sin is great, if the penitent is already remorseful, maybe you can be, maybe the penance can be mitigated. The penance should be clear. That is to say, all right, for your penance, say as many rosaries as you can say before you fall asleep. But I don't think the penance is clear. A penance should have a clear beginning and it should have a clear end. Do not give as a penance to a person who has committed abortion. All right, since you kill the person, you adopt a baby. That's not, the penance should be clear. And it should not be revealing of the sin confessed. Uh, there is a When we were in the minor seminary, and there was a priest whose penance for masturbation was Stations of the Cross. So anyone who went to confession to him and was seen making the Station of the Cross, which maybe it is also good to be creative in the penance that you impose on your penance. A fifth particular norm, Canon 982. A person who confesses to having falsely denounced to ecclesiastical authority a confessor innocent of the crime of solicitation to a sin against the sixth commandment of the Decalogue is not to be absolved unless that person has first formally withdrawn the false denunciation and is prepared to make good whatever that should be harmed, whatever harm may have been done. The matter of Canon 982 is the false denunciation for the crime of solicitation. We had already said something about the crime of have we? No, sorry. We had said something about the a sin, the absolution of an accomplice in a sin against the sixth commandment. So I will have to say something about solicitation. Regarding solicitation, we are looking at Canon 1387. What is the sin of solicitation? According to Canon 1387, a priest who in confession or on the occasion of confession or under the pretext of confession solicits a penitent to sin against the sixth commandment of the Decalogue is to be punished according to the gravity of the offense. In more serious cases, he is to be dismissed from the clerical state. First, let me then say something about solicitation. Solicitation is a sin that is a term that covers a multitude of sins. Solicitation is the attempt of the confessor to induce the penitent or another person through the penitent to sin against the sixth commandment, again, against justice. This, the penitent could sin by himself. For example, by bad advice, maybe the confessor will say, it's okay to masturbate. Or he could induce the penitent to sin with another. It is better that your girlfriend masturbate you rather than fornicate with her. Or to sin with the confessor. Let me show you how. In fact, the penitent does not even have to commit the sin because he may resist the confessor. If the confessor tries to induce him to sin with him, he may even ignore the advice of the confessor. The act of solicitation consists in the attempt of the confessor. If the confessor attempts, there is a sin against it is if then there is solicitation. If the confessor gives bad advice and the penitent follows it, then the solicitation becomes worse. If the confessor gives bad advice and the penitent follows the advice and sins with another person, then the solicitation even becomes even worse. Now, if the solicitation consists in the confessor leading the penitent to sin with him, and the penitent gives in, then there is a very, very grave sin. That is why the penalty in is to be punished according to the gravity of the offense, because there is a calibration, there are degrees in the offense. In more serious cases, for example, he solicits a minor to sin with him, compassion, then in more serious cases, he is to be dismissed from the clerical state. This is the matter of solicitation. Now, the attempt must have some connection with the, what did I say, statement here? With the state of confession. For example, in the sacramental context itself, during confession itself, or immediately before the uh, the penitent kneels down before the confessor, and the confessor starts fondling her, for example. Or after the sacrament, she confesses or he confesses, and after he gives the absolution, then he tries to touch her. If the solicitation was done on the occasion of confession, the penitent was intending to make his confession, or if the solicitation was done on the pretext of confession, the priest says, "Come, come, come, come. We make your confession. I'm available now." Or if the solicitation occurs in the confessional places, confessional box, reconciliation, there must be some connection with the confession. As a matter of fact, today, many canon lawyers and moral theologians speak of inchoate, or it's like a startup, a starting, the beginning of solicitation. For example, the confessor does not do any of the things in confession, but the confessor asks for his or her email address, or her Facebook account, or her uh, phone number, cell phone number. And then, or even maybe he can even write a letter and says, "Open this, please read it when after you leave." It may the act, the direct act may not have happened in confession, but it started in confession. That's why they talk about an inchoate, the beginnings of solicitation in confession. The aggressive party must be the confessor. If it is the penitent, then there is no solicitation, unless if it is the penitent who invites and the confessor agrees, then I think there is still solicitation, because the confessor should have known better. We are talking here about false denunciation. So the concept, what is this? What is the concept here? Uh, the concept of a false denunciation. First, the priest must be accused of and denounced for solicitation. We already had said something about solicitation, and not for any other crime. He is not denounced for stealing. He's not denounced for unfairness. He's not denounced for too much interested in money. He's not denounced for not preparing his homily. He's denounced for one particular crime, namely solicitation. Second, the priest must be, as a matter of fact, innocent of this specific, particular incident of solicitation. In other words, if a priest is being denounced, it is not solicitation in general. It must be there must be a particular specific reference. When is this supposed to have happened? The accusation must be false. That is to say, the denouncer must be aware that the accusation is, as a matter of fact, false. There is therefore malice and bad faith on the part of the denouncer. The accusation does not have to be made by the penitent himself. It could be done by a third party. It could be somebody to whom he told the story. It could be done by somebody, maybe the penitent did not tell him, but he just thought that it would be a good idea to denounce the confessor. Now, regarding false denunciation itself, it is both a sin and a delictum. Canon 982 treats false denunciation as a sin. Well, first of all, sin is a violation of a moral law, while delictum is a violation of a law. It does not have to be moral, but it could be moral. It is a violation, a delictum is a violation of a law to which a penalty, at least general, is attached. Now, Canon 982 treats false denunciation as a sin. One who confesses to this sin is not to be absolved unless he makes a formal retraction of the accusation that he has made. The retraction must be made in the external forum. In other words, it's not enough to confess to you. If he made it in writing, the retraction must be made in writing. If the retraction was made before the bishop or some superior of the confessor, the retraction must also be made in a letter to that superior. And he is prepared to make reparation if necessary. Now, Canon 1390, paragraph 1, treats false denunciation as a crime. As I said, it is a delictum because it is a violation of a law to which a penalty is attached. According to the first paragraph of 1390, a person who falsely denounces a confessor of the offense of solicitation to an ecclesiastical superior incurs a latae sententiae interdict, and if a cleric, there is an additional penalty, namely suspension. So if it is a layman, it is interdict. If he is also a cleric, at least a deacon, an interdict and a suspension. So even if the condition mentioned in Canon 982 are fulfilled, he has retracted it, he has made, he is willing to make reparations if necessary, the false denouncer still cannot be absolved because of the latae sententiae interdict, which forbids the reception of the sacrament. Remember, an interdict forbids the reception of the sacrament. It forbids by reception, you mean he cannot attend, he cannot participate ministerially in the Mass, he cannot receive communion, he cannot he cannot make his confession, and that is why you cannot absolve him. Penalties such as the interdict can only be remitted by persons with jurisdiction in the external forum, namely local ordinaries. The confessor who does not have the faculty to remit penalties can absolve the false denouncer only under two circumstances. Danger of death, we did say something about that in a moment earlier on, and casus urgens, Canon 1357, we have not yet said anything about that, and we will say something about that in a while. So normally, a confessor cannot absolve a person who admits to having made a false denunciation of a confessor for solicitation. As a rule, he can, however, absolve it under two circumstances, namely danger of death and in casus urgens. Outside of these two cases, if not casus urgens, is not danger of death, a confessor must tell the penitent to get in contact with a local ordinary. A confessor can also offer to do the contacting on behalf of the penitent. Should that be the case, you, the confessor, can call the local ordinary, the bishop or the vicar general, and say, a penitent, no mention of name, has mentioned this, and I offered to do it for him. If the penitent goes to the bishop can remit the penalty and he can absolve the penitent himself also. Or he can send him back to the confessor for the original confessor to remit to absolve the sin. The seal of confession, Canon 983. The sacramental seal is inviolable. Accordingly, it is absolutely wrong for a confessor in any way to betray the penitent. Canon 984. The confessor is wholly forbidden to use knowledge acquired in confession to the detriment of the penitent, even when all danger of disclosure is excluded. 983 and 984 are related to the seal of confession. Canon 983 talks about revealing the sin and the sinner. Canon 984 is not talking about revealing the sin and the sinner, but Canon 984 forbids the confessor from using any knowledge learned in confession. You cannot use it outside. Now, I will say something in a moment to explain the meaning of the to the detriment of the penitent. Let us move on. Everything manifested by the penitent to the confessor during confession is covered by the seal, even if absolution may have been denied. Why would you deny absolution? You would deny absolution, for example, if you think that the penitent is not adequately sorry or remorseful, or if the penitent is not prepared to do reparation that may be necessary, or if the penitent, if you cannot absolve the sin because you realize that the penitent is under excommunication or interdict. But even so, even if absolution may have been denied for any of those reasons, anything that is manifested by the penitent to the confessor during confession is covered by the sacramental seal. Simply, Canon 983, what does Canon 983 prohibit? It prohibits the revelation of the sin and the sinner. So you must not make any comment that can link the sin to the sinner. I will give examples of that. 984 prohibits the using of any information acquired in confession, even when the danger of disclosure of sin and the sinner is excluded. For example, uh, you are giving a conference to a religious community, and you have been hearing their confessions too, and something has been reported about sexual sins in the community. During the conference, do not mention that. Why? Especially because if it is a common sin, then people will think that the reference is to that, even if you're not making a reference. They will feel, and therefore, if they feel that you are making a reference to them, maybe they will be discouraged from from approaching the sacrament. And therefore, that is a gravamen, that is a detriment to the penitent. Not to any particular or specific penitent, but to penitents in general. People will say, I won't go to confession na lang because the priests man pala do not, the confessors do not respect. So what is the reason for not using any of the information acquired in confession? Is because it will damage the integrity, it will damage the integrity, it will damage the reputation, not just of the confessor, but of the sacrament of penance. And so people will be discouraged from. Another example of using knowledge that is uh, acquired in confession. Supposing you are an active, you're active in selling and buying stocks, and a well-known stock broker goes to confession to you, and in the course of his confession, he does mention that his company is going to sell unload, as I think is the term they use. He's going to unload their stocks for this company in the next week or so, and therefore the price of the stock will go down. Now you happen to have stocks also of that company, and so as soon as the confession is over, you call up your stockbroker and you say, "Sell my stock." You have used the information used acquired in confession. You are Canon 984 prohibits the use of that information, even if no disclosure, even if there is no danger of disclosing, of betraying the sin and the sinner. Or also the ridiculous example that sometimes a penitent will confess to you and says, "Father, I put poison in the wine that you are going to use for Mass today." When you say Mass, what will you do? Somebody says, "I will accidentally spill the wine cruet that is using the knowledge acquired in confession, and this is prohibited by Canon 9.8." A point I had said earlier and a point that I will say again in the second bullet point. The gravamen, the detriment to the penitent that the canon talks about, does not refer to any specific penitent, to this or to that penitent. The idea is that if knowledge from confession may be used, people will be afraid to approach the sacrament, and this will be to their detriment. Let us move on. Now, there is usually a distinction between direct violation of the seal, where the sin and the sinner are identified. The uh, judge of this case had confessed that he ignored the pleading of this lawyer in this case. An indirect violation of the seal, where only the sin is revealed. There are some cases where they have ignored some general thing, or only the sinner, judge, an RTC judge, came to confess. But we must be careful, because even when we think that it is the case of indirect violation, other circumstances may link the sin to the sinner. For example, uh, a group of your friends are, have organized a silver ordination anniversary for you. They have a party and you are late, and and as they are waiting for you, they have all sorts of stories, and somebody says, I think I hold the distinction of being the first person to be absolved by Father X. When you arrive at the party and you're going to give a speech, and then you say, "I remember the very first confession that I heard," and they start talking about. You may think that you did not reveal the sinner, but there are other circumstances that would enable others to link the sin with the sin. That is why I will say now, and I will say it again in a moment, what you hear in confession should remain in the confession. I will have more to say about that by way of examples in a moment. Who is bound by the sacramental seal? Only the confessor, Canon 983, paragraph 1. All others who may get come to the knowledge, the interpreter, should his services be required. Any other person who might gain access to the matter confessed. Somebody was passing by the confessional and he heard. You were in the reconciliation room and somebody was repairing the aircon and he heard. All other persons who might gain access to the matter confessed, they're all bound to keep the secret. But their obligation is different formally from the obligation of the confessor. The possible violation by others is provided for and dealt with by Canon 1388 paragraph. Canons 983 and 984 forbid in an absolute manner the violation of the seal and the use of the knowledge acquired from confession. The obligation is absolute and no exception is contemplated. As a matter of fact, I will underline that no exception is contemplated. I take the hard line. Therefore, if we take a look at Canon 983 and 984, there are three obligations arising from these two canons. One, observe the sacramental seal, binding the confessor. Observe the secret, binding the confessor and anyone else who may come to the knowledge of the matter that is confessed. Do not use the knowledge acquired in confession. Binding, it is an obligation, binding both the confessor and anyone else who might come to the knowledge of the matter. Now, regarding the knowledge acquired in confession, do not use the knowledge acquired in confession to the detriment of the penitent. Do not use the knowledge in external government. The confessor could be a superior or could have become one in the meantime. This is the reason why the code discourages superiors from hearing the confessions of their subjects. Canon 985 and Canon 630 paragraph. Some observations. Again, this is a pastoral guidelines. The more prudent norm is that whatever you hear in confession should remain in the confession. Further, it is wiser, it's more prudent to treat each confessional episode as discrete, separate, even if the confessor may think he is dealing with the same penitent. For example, uh, a penitent comes to you and they says, Father, forgive me for I have sinned. Last time we did talk about the sin that I confessed, and I have to say that I was in large measure able to control the temptation, but twice I slipped again. The professor says, "Oh, does that mean that you visited a porn site again?" Oh, Father, no, that's not me. That's my classmate. It's something else. You don't do that. And if he says that I slip again, say, all right, can you remind me what that sin is all about again? Treat the each confessional episode as a discrete, separate episode. Letter B. Can the penitent release the confessor from the obligation to observe the sacramental seal. For example, the for example, a penitent comes to you and says, "I assisted my barkada to lure his girlfriend into this, maybe not girlfriend. I assisted my barkada to lure this girl into his car where uh, rape was committed. I did not participate. I just lured the helped lure the girl into his car, and then I left. And then the two of them are accused. And can the penitent release you and say, Father, can you please tell him, tell the court, tell the police, tell the lawyer that what I confess, that I did not participate and that, etc., etc. Joan, a canon lawyer, thinks that the penitent can release the confessor. Another canon lawyer, Meyer, does not think that it can be done. I myself think that it should not be done, that it cannot be done. I offer a practical solution, maybe to ask the penitent to tell the confessor again, this time outside the confession. But that is not going to solve the problem. I think uh, doing that will just paint the confessor into a corner. I think the wiser, the more prudent, the safer thing to do is no, I will not reveal, and I would like to support the position of Meyer that no, the penitent, not even the penitent, can release me. And why do I say that? Because when the sacramental seal is broken, this time, of course, to the advantage of the penitent, but other penitents will say, the seal can be broken. And so, the gravamen still remains. People will be afraid to approach the sacrament of confession because of the fear that the confessor may, under one or another circumstance, may be allowed to break the confessionals. The sanctions. The direct violation of the seal of confession calls for a latae sententiae excommunication reserved to the Holy See. Canon 1388, paragraph 1. I don't know how historically accurate this is, but remember, I don't know if this was mentioned in your Philippine history class, that the wife of a Katipunero is supposed to to the have gone to a confession, and the confessed that the Katipuneros are organizing and that her husband is part of it, and that's how we came to know of it. And so the confessor went to the Guardia Civil and they arrested the Katipuneros. If that is true, then that would be a direct violation of the seal of confession, linking the sin with the sinner. It is also the use of knowledge used in confession, knowledge learned in confession, uh, for external purposes. If that is true, then the confessor would have incurred, would have violated the seal of confession directly, and therefore he would have incurred the latae sententia excommunication, and that penalty, the remission of that penalty is reserved to the Holy See. Second, an indirect violation of the seal. There are indeterminate and gradually increasing penalties. Canon 1349. Why is the penalty indeterminate and why is it gradually increasing? Because it is very difficult to prove. Third, the violation of the secret. Again, they are to be punished with a just penalty, not excluding excommunication. Uh, what is this? When can when does the violation merit excommunication? I would imagine, for example, some years ago, there were a group of I don't know. There must be researchers or something like that. They had planted tape recorders in uh, several, maybe even confessionals in the churches in Rome. And after that, they published the transcript of those recordings. They are not the confessors, so they would not have violated the seal, but they would have violated the secret. They having come to the knowledge of the matter that is mentioned in confession. Now, if they're Catholics, I think it was a continuing violation, and if there was a certain malice in it, maybe the penalty, uh, the penalty, they could be punished with a just penalty, and that could include excommunication. There is no penalty for the use of the knowledge acquired in confession because it is almost impossible to determine this. But the fact that there is no sanction does not mean that the law may be taken lightly. It is an important norm and it should be taken seriously as a normative guideline. Remember what is at stake here. What is at stake? The loss of the confidence of the faithful in the sacrament of confession. Therefore, they will stay away from the sacrament of confession. Therefore, they will stay away from the opportunity to be reconciled with God and with the Christian because of irresponsible practice. Some irresponsible practice. All right, the the second part of the second part of this is penalties in the church, and this is quite long. I would like to touch on the important parts of the provisions of canons 1311 to 1399. These notes treat the matter of the sacrament of reconciliation and canonical penalties in the strict sense under the following four headings. Penalties in the church in general. Letter B, the application of those penalties on offenders. Letter C, the remission of these penalties. And letter D, the configuration of some of the special delicta according to the 1983 Code of Canon. Let us take a look at the first. Penalties in the church. Ecclesiastical penalties in general. There are two kinds of penalties in the church. One is called medicinal, or the technical word for it is there are censures. Canons 1331, 1332, and Canon 1332. The second kind of penalty is expiatory penalties. Canons 1336. First, censures or medicinal penalties. The penalty, this type of penalty, is a deprivation of the means of salvation. What are the means of salvation in the church? The sacraments and the sacramentals. By this penalty, the church intends to break the bad will of the offender and lead him back to conversion and reform. By these penalties, the church applies the medicine, that's why they're called medicinal, to break the bad will of the offender and to lead him back to conversion and reform. And in the pharmacy, the canonical pharmacy of the church, there are three and only three medicines or censures: excommunication, interdict, and suspension. The deprivation of these spiritual goods and means to salvation, sacraments and sacramentals, is intended to make the sinner aware of the seriousness of his condition and thus the need for reform. It is a wake-up call. The basis of the penalty is bad will and contumacy. Contumacy is lack of remorse. The finality or purpose is reform and conversion. So when somebody is excommunicated, the whole purpose is you're saying, you know, you are in a serious spiritual condition. And preventing you from going to confession and preventing you from receiving our Lord in the Eucharist. This is to call your attention to the seriousness of your situation. And I hope that you are able, therefore, to reform and to return to the Lord. Now, if this is what the censure, the medicinal penalty is all about, therefore, A, a previous warning is required for the valid imposition of the penalty. This canon refers only, as we shall say in below, we shall say later on, to ferende sententiae penalties. Why? Because a ferend, what do we mean by that? Before a penalty is imposed, you must warn the person. Why do you need to warn him? Because you want to make sure that that the person is aware that he is doing wrong, that the person is aware of his serious condition. That's why you have to warn him. Now, if he, oops, I didn't know that that was such a bad thing, and therefore he reforms, then you don't need to impose the penalty. The warning is to determine wake up call. The the warning is to make sure that the person is aware of the malice of what he is doing. On the other hand, a late sentencia penalty is not said to be imposed. Why not? Because, I mean, no, late sentencia penalties are not imposed because late sentencia penalties are incurred automatically. For example, a doctor who performs abortion incurs the excommunication, the penalty of excommunication automatically. Why automatically? Because the presumption is he's a doctor, he ought to know that it is wrong. And therefore, that's why the warning is not necessary. He should know. The presumption of the law is that he knows that it is wrong. And that is why it is incurred automatically. Now, if the doctor repeats the abortion, he has an abortion clinic as it were, then maybe the bishop can, local ordinary, can take the further step of declaring that the doctor has been excommunicated. He's just declaring a fact. He's not doing anything new. Why? Because the doctor had already incurred the penalty. What the bishop is doing, what the local ordinary is doing, is taking the additional step of making a declaration. He had already incurred the penalty, and now I am declaring the the fact that that the doctor had incurred the penalty. Maybe another example, when Archbishop Lefebvre had announced that he will ordain 4 members of the Pius XI group to become bishop, John Paul II had pleaded with him and says, do not ordain. This will create a schism in the church. But what did Archbishop Lefebvre do? He ordained them anyway. And therefore, by the mere fact that he had ordained his 4, he had already incurred the penalty of excommunication automatically, late sentence. But later on, well, I don't know how long after, there was a declaration in Osservatore Romano declaring the fact that Archbishop Lefebvre and the 4 bishops that he consecrated, the the declaration said to the effect that their excommunication is being declared. Did the declaration do anything new? No. It simply declared the fact that Archbishop Lefebvre and the 4 people that he had ordained bishops are have already been had already incurred the late sententiae penalty of excommunication. The penalty is in effect until the offender recedes from contumacy, bad will, or malice. Remember that what is the purpose of a medicinal penalty? The purpose of the censure or the medicinal uh, penalty is to cure, heal. It is to be a medicine for the offender so that he becomes aware of the gravity of his situation, of his spiritual situation in the church. Therefore, the penalty is in effect until the medicine takes effect. What is the effect of the medicine? To say, oops, I am sorry, I should not have that. Canon 1358. Therefore, there is no predetermined duration of the censure. Why not? Because you don't know beforehand when the medicine will take effect. The penalty is lifted only through its remission by a competent ecclesiastical authority, and the superior cannot remit the penalty unless the purpose has been achieved. On the other hand, he cannot refuse the remission of the penalty if the purpose had already been achieved. So, if the purpose is to bring him back to remorse and contrition, letter C, there is no predetermined duration of the censure because you don't know beforehand when the medicine will take effect. If the offender is sorry, if the offender now is converts and is willing to do what penance is imposed, then the competent superior must remit the penalty. But he cannot remit the penalty unless he is satisfied that the object of the penalty, the purpose of the penalty has been achieved. But he cannot refuse the remission of the penalty if the purpose had already been achieved. He cannot say, "Oh, but I just imposed the penalty yesterday." No. If if the purpose of the penalty has been achieved, then the the superior is obliged in justice to remit the penalty. There are, however, exceptions to Canon 1347, paragraph 1. 1347, paragraph 1 says, a censure cannot be validly imposed unless the offender has beforehand received at least one warning. Canon 1347 says censures cannot be imposed without at least one warning. Why? Well, because the point of the why is a warning necessary, as I explained earlier. A warning is necessary because of the point, or because of the purpose, because of the finality of the penalty. The penalty is to ensure that the offender becomes so that the offender is sorry. Now, if he's sorry immediately, then there's no need for the penalty. That's why a warning is necessary. However, there are some exceptions to Canon 1347, paragraph 1. Some censures can be incurred automatically, validly, even without the warning required by Canon 1347, paragraph 1. The requirement that must be fulfilled so that the late sentential penalty can be incurred, there must be a warning, are so stringent that these requirements are almost the equivalent of a warning. For example, not only must the offender be objectively, not only must the offense be objectively grave, but the commission of the crime themselves seems to presuppose a certain amount of premeditation. Let me pause there and try to explain. The example of Archbishop Lefebvre of ordaining the four bishops without pontifical mandate. Of course, before he did that, he must have thought about it. He is a bishop. As a matter of fact, I think he's a canon lawyer. Then he must have known the offense to be objectively grave. And that is why the penalty is incurred automatically. That's why the penalty is incurred late sentence. The offense themselves seem to presuppose a certain amount of premeditation. The next sentence. Except for some offenses which can be committed in a snap decision. And this could be committed by an unbalanced mind. Physical attack on the Pope or Bishop, the simulation of the Eucharist, or sacramental absolution. The other crimes punishable by late sententiae censure are characterized by deliberation. Certainly, abortion is not something that, uh, the, it is done by doctors. There must be deliberation. Now, what about the other one that seems to have late sententiae penalty, like attack on the Pope or Bishop, physical attack on the Pope or Bishop? Well, there's no premeditation there, but because of the objective harm. The simulation of the Eucharist, again, because of the objective harm. Simulation of the Eucharist, you are not a priest and you are pretending to consecrate. You are not a priest and you are pretending to absolve. Can you imagine the harm that you perpetrate against the innocent faithful? Now, because of the gravity of these offenses, the late sententiae censure is threatened. I hope I am making sense. The three crimes which could be committed by an unbalanced person in a snap decisions are threatened with this penalty because of the gravity of the offense, the objective gravity of the offense. In other words, these penalties can be incurred automatically even without the warning required by 1347 paragraph 1 because of the mala voluntas and the contumacy in this malice, which the warning is supposed to verify, are so clear, making the warning unnecessary. Okay, let us move on to the next type of medicine. I'm sorry. Let us to the next type of penalty. Remember, in the church, there are only two kinds of penalties: censure or medicine, medicinal, and we will say more about that in a moment. And what are these three? Excommunication, interdict, and suspension. The second type are expiatory penalties. They are enumerated in Canon 1336 and 1338. The enumeration is not complete. They are exemplary. They do not involve the deprivation of the means of salvation, sacraments and sacramentals. The general effect of the penalty is therefore less serious, since they do not forbid the person's access to the sacrament. Their purpose is not the conversion of the offender, but to repair the damage done to the objective order of justice. In other words, if the object of the medicine is the person, the subjective condition of the offender, to bring him back to sorrow and contrition, to bring him back to repentance and conversion. The purpose of an expiatory penalty is objective, to repair the damage done to the objective order of justice, to restore justice. It is like, if you stole money, it is not enough to be sorry, you have to pay back, the so-called restorative justice. The purpose is not the conversion of the offender, but to repair the damage done. So, its duration can be determined beforehand. You can say 1 year away from the territory, 6 months of confinement in a monastery, etc., etc. The offender is, the offense is there, and the superior makes the punishment, makes the penalty, makes the expiatory penalty commensurate with the offense. And so he can determine that beforehand. Expiatory penalties are, as a rule, ferende sententiae. Canon 1336, paragraph 2. As we observe, the penalty is not directed towards the reform of the offender, but the restoration of justice. It does not depend on the conversion of the individual, so that even when the offender has reformed and the sin which was the cause of the penalty has been absolved, the penalty may still continue to bind. Expiatory penalties can end in any of these manners. When the determined period of time elapses, through the intervention of a competent superior, if the superior said, okay, the predetermined time has not yet been completed, but I think it has served its purpose. It is like parole. Or the death of the offender. If the offender dies, well, obviously you cannot he cannot continue serving his penalty in this life, perhaps in the next. Some expiatory penalties can be perpetual. For example, dismissal from the clerical state. Okay, now let us move on to some penalties in particular. We are now going to take a look at some comments on censures or medicinal penalties. And then if we have enough time, I will say something about expiatory penalties. Censures or medicinal penalties. Canon law says there are three and only three such penalties: excommunication, interdict, suspension. Where sometimes I think we have encountered the term taxative. Taxative. Tax. It is a it is a technical term in canon law, and it has this sense. Taxative means it is a complete listing. Outside of this complete listing, outside of this taxative listing, nothing else. Like we met this before. Some of the irregularities and some of the irregularities for ordination are listed. And if it is not in the list, then it is not an irregularity. Similarly, censures or in canon law, censures and or medicinal penalties are only three: excommunication, interdict, and suspension. Let me say a brief comment on each of these. Excommunication, the penalty has several effects, and these effects cannot be separated. They are inseparable. When a person incurs the penalty, he incurs all these prohibitions. The excommunicated person is prohibited from ministerial participation in ceremonies of public worship. What is forbidden? Ministerial participation. Participation in what? In ceremonies of public, or maybe better, official worship. So the priest is forbidden from celebrating or concelebrating the Eucharist. The lector or the special minister of the Eucharist from their function, the deacon from reading the gospel, from preaching. If the participation is not ministerial, it is not prohibited by this canon. So the excommunicated person can attend Mass, for example. Letter B. The excommunicated is prohibited to celebrate the sacraments and the sacramental. So an excommunicated priest is not allowed to hear confessions, to say Mass, bless a home, perform a funeral. An excommunicated layman or laywoman cannot get married, since they are the ministers of the sacrament. And they are forbidden to receive the sacraments, including reconciliation. That is why when somebody is excommunicated, you cannot absolve him, because excommunication forbids the celebration of the sacraments. The excommunicated person is forbidden to exercise any ecclesiastical offices, ministries, functions, or acts of government. The priest cannot be the qualified witness in a marriage. He cannot say, do you take X here present as your lawful wife? Can you take this man as your lawful husband? He cannot place acts of governance. The priest cannot declare a marriage null if he is a judge in the tribunal. The excommunicated bishop cannot transfer a priest. He cannot incardinate or excardinate a priest. He cannot vote in a council, etc. The excommunicated person is forbidden to exercise any ecclesiastical office. Now, in letter D, if the excommunication has been declared or imposed, there are additional effects of this censure. If the excommunicatus insists to participate in the Eucharist or any ceremony of public worship, is to say, participate to to be exercise a ministerial participation, the excommunicatus is to be removed physically if necessary, or the ceremony is to be suspended, unless of course if you're prudent, unless there's a grave reason to the contrary. Any act of governance would be invalid. If the penalty was not declared, the act would have been merely illicit. So, the wedding he officiates at would be invalid for defective form. His decision to declare a marriage null would be invalid. The new assignment from the bishop would be null. The excommunicatus cannot validly assume any office or function in the church. He cannot assume the office of pastor or rector or lector or minister, at least not while the excommunication is enforced. The interdict, one who is under interdict is bound by the following concrete penalties. The interdictus is prohibited from ministerial participation in ceremonies of public worship. The priest from concelebrating the Eucharist, the lector, special minister of the Eucharist from their function, the deacon from reading the gospel or preaching. If the participation is not ministerial, it is not prohibited by this canon. The interdictus is prohibited to celebrate the sacrament and the sacramentals. The excommunicated priest is not allowed to hear confessions, to say mass, etc., etc. If the interdict was imposed or declared, there are additional effects of this penalty. Should the interdictus insist to participate in the Eucharist or any other ceremony of public worship, the interdicted person is to remove physically if necessary, or the ceremony is to be suspended unless there is a grave reason to the contrary. Now, it seems that that interdict and excommunication are the same. Well, they're not the same. They could be the same, but they're not the same. Excommunication, when a person is excommunicated, all those penalties are incurred together. In interdict, the penalties can be separated. And therefore, the decree declaring the interdict or imposing the interdict must specify which of the penalties is being applied to this person. Perhaps another point that I should say is that in the old code of canon law, sometimes an interdict could be imposed on a place. Like the interdict could be imposed on the parish of our of Mary Help of Christians, like one of these quarantine on barangays. In the new code of canon law, interdict can only be imposed on persons, not on places. The third medicinal penalty is suspension. It is a penalty that has these three characteristics. It affects only clerics. meaning uh, deacons, presbyters, bishops. The effects are divisible. That has to be corrected. The effects are divisible, unlike excommunication, because as I said, interdict is divisible. And it is only a medicinal penalty. The following and only the following are the three possible effects of suspension. It can prohibit all or some acts of the power of order. This used to be called suspensio divinis in the old code. For example, the suspended cleric cannot say mass in this place, or cannot say public masses, or is forbidden from hearing confession. The decree of suspension should specify what the cleric is being suspended from. Second, it can prohibit all or some acts of the power of governance. For example, the suspended cleric may be forbidden to exercise his office as judge in the tribunal or as treasurer of the diocese. Third, it can prohibit the exercise of some or all of the rights and functions attaching to an office. The pastor may be forbidden to delegate others to hear confession or to perform marriages. Suspension forbids these things. Therefore, the penalty affects only the legality of these acts. So that if the suspended person were to act in defiance of these prohibitions, the act would be valid but illicit. However, a law which establishes the penalty of suspension can determine that when this penalty is imposed or declared, it can have the further effect of invalidating the acts of governance possible. Nevertheless, the invalidating effect cannot be established as part of a late sententiae penalties that has not been declared. When the suspension is unqualified and general, for example, Canons 1370 paragraph 2, 1378 paragraph 2 number 2, 1390 paragraph 1, 1394 paragraph 1, the penalty is understood to have all these three effects of suspension. It is therefore the duty of the ecclesiastical authority imposing or declaring the penalty to specify the effects of the suspension. For without the qualification, the censure will be understood to have all three effects. When the suspension is late sententiae, then it has all these three effects. For example, Canons 1370 paragraph 2, 1378 paragraph 2, 1390 paragraph 1, and 1394 paragraph 1. Some concrete instances when the suspension is qualified. 1383. The bishop who confers orders without the ministerial letters cannot confer that order for a year, and the cleric who was ordained without the ministerial letters cannot exercise that order received. Here, there is a suspension, and the suspension is given a term of 1 year. Now, let me move on to some of these expiatory penalties, but let us pause.